What's up, guys, and welcome to the Week 2 player pool. Going to take a look at the Week 2 slate for DraftKings, including a game of the week, which I was surprised to see the ownership projections for and actually had to do a double take. And I'll get into it right after this. What's up, guys? Simon Edwards at PumaCom with Heat Seeker Sports. You're watching Player Pool. This is a show where I break down the NFL Week 2 slate. I'm going to do the main slate on this show. And there are a lot of decent values that I see this week. And I think that it seems pretty straightforward on at least my initial passes on this slate. I did do a decent amount of research this week on my numbers and everything like that, as opposed to last week where I was taking a look at it for the first time. But yeah, I've been pretty surprised by some of the ownership projections on this one. I feel like there are some games that were no-brainers that are maybe being overlooked a little bit. So we'll get into that here in a second. Make sure to hit that like button. Looking for 30 likes so I can put out a shorter video a little bit later on. And make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'm just about at 800 subscribers. I'm looking to hit 1,000 subscribers on that YouTube channel. So that helps me out. If you guys had any success last week with the content that I put out, like I had captains, I think every single showdown captain I recommended ended up hitting. And then on top of that, we hit big on the main slate last week, ended up coming in third in the slant, and had a couple really close calls with getting my first seats in the live final events. And that was all from, just barely doing any research last week for the main slate. But this week had more time to go over some stuff, so we'll dig into that here. Let's see. Going to go switch over to present my screen here. And we're looking at, just DraftKings on this one. A lot of this stuff, carries over to FanDuel as well, as far as, maybe my favorite spots and everything. And I'll let you know if I see anything specific to FanDuel, like that would be more advantageous to play over there. But for the most part, this is a DraftKings breakdown. Also do some Underdog stuff. I have Underdog as a sponsor, and right now, if you use the promo code SEEK on Underdog, if you're a first-time depositor there, they're going to match you up to $1,000. It's going to be a 50% deposit match for up to $1,000 on your first deposit. So make sure to go over there and use the promo code SEEK. They got a lot of cool pick'em contests. Last week on the show, I gave a pick 4 that ended up hitting, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later on in the show. See if we can cobble together a good pick 4 for this week as well. So, gonna look through this player pool real quick. You can see from the quarterback perspective, looks like Lamar Jackson is the most expensive quarterback, followed by Mahomes, Richardson, Prescott. If we go a little bit, towards the bottom of this, we see Justin Fields is pretty close to min price at 5,400, but he's got a tough matchup against Denver, playing in Denver. Daniel Jones has a really good matchup playing against Washington. He's only 5,300, which makes sense because last week he was awful, and he's coming off an ACL tear too, so he's not going to have that same mobility that we would normally target him in a spot like this for, with Washington being such a horrible secondary. Sam Darnold is pretty cheap too. He's playing the 49ers. He's at 5,200. Will Levis at 5,200. Will Levis played terrible last week. Sam Darnold played really well last week. Bryce Young, of course, he's down here too, and Minshew, and the island of misfit toys down here as far as quarterbacks. If you go dig a little deeper, you can see Bo Nix down here at 5K. I think that's really it for starters. So that's probably about as low as you're going to get as a starter. I think as far as those super low prices, Daniel Jones is the only one I have like real interest in down at this level. And as you can see from what he did last week, he only had 186 yards passing, but that was even being generous with how he performed last week. And I don't think that, I've been saying for the last couple years, ever since, Dayball stole that coach of the year from Kyle Shanahan, that, he's just not good. And this Giants team does not look any better than it did before. The year that he won coach of the year, they had a super soft schedule, and like they just weren't that impressive relative to all the accolades they were getting. And then they kind of showed out last year on not being that great of a team. And then this year, of course, they're locked in on Jones because they gave him a huge contract last year, and they're just not getting any better. Derek Carr's down here too at 5,300. He did really well last week. 21 DraftKings points last week, but he's got a tougher matchup this week in Dallas. So let's go game by game. But first, let's take a look at these other positions here, because we have a few min or close to min price guys that are going to be affected by injuries. Let's see. On the running back position, McLaughlin is interesting at 4,500. Take a look here. Bigsby got a lot more work than you would expect, at least what we were expecting heading into the season. Last year, he didn't really make an impact, but last week he ended up getting a decent amount of work that kind of took away from Etienne's workload, which was surprising to me, at least. He had 12 attempts for 73 yards. I don't know how that's going to affect Etienne moving forward, but we're going to have to take a look. Jordan Mason is at 5,200. Had that monster week. We called him on the show. I had him as a pick in my short YouTube short later on in the day. That was before Christian McCaffrey was called out with an injury, and I really like Jordan Mason just going into that game in general as a way to build a story around fading Christian McCaffrey in our lineups. And if that news had come out like right before lock, like we all would have just crushed, because Mason obviously had that monster game. 25 DraftKings points on, I think he was like a $2,000 salary or $2,300 salary on Showdown. But yeah, we would have just absolutely crushed that slate, because I liked him even with Christian McCaffrey playing, and it's just unfortunate that news came out so early in the day, but still did well on that slate. Let's see. He's got another good matchup tonight, and we'll dig into that in a minute. And he's very cheap. J.K. Dobbins is only 5,400, and J.K. Dobbins showed up last week. He got 25.9 DraftKings points and did really well versus Las Vegas, and just was not expecting that at all out of J.K. Dobbins coming off the Achilles and ACL ruptures. So, just to have him kind of step into week one and just dominate with his touches. He only had 10 attempts for 135 yards, 3 receptions for 4 yards on top of that. But J.K. Dobbins is a guy that we want to keep an eye on this week, especially against that Carolina defense. And so we'll dig into that. And I think that's it for the cheaper guy. Oh, Zach Charbonnet, because we got Kenneth Walker out. He's only 5,800 and didn't do too much last week, but he should get a full work. He's going to get a full workload this week. So he's facing off against New England. Jerome Ford scored a touchdown last week, I believe, and he ended up with 19 DraftKings points. So we got a bunch of guys in this cheap range this week. Even Ramondre Stevenson is pretty cheap at 6,200. So we'll take a look at that. Let's look at wide receivers, see if we see anyone really stands out from a cheap perspective here. Now there are a couple rookies that I like this week, and I'll get into. There's one in particular who is set up based on how he performed last week that people might overlook this week just because he didn't really do anything last week, but he's in a really good matchup that apparently fits his skill set because he was really good at separating last week, and he's in a man coverage situation this week, and we'll get into that as we're going through the game by games. Wan'Dale Robinson stands out this week against that Washington slot defense at 4,300. Let's see. Demarcus Robinson is going to stand out this week at 4K. That's really cheap, and he's going to be getting a decent amount of work probably against Arizona this week. And he's kind of been one of Stafford's go-to guys. He really showed up last year when Kupp was dealing with his injuries. He came in, and they play a lot of 3 wide receiver sets on top of it. So Robinson's going to get a ton of opportunity this week. See if we can see anyone else that stands out in the cheaper range before we dig into this game-by-game situation. None that I can see off the top of my head, but when we dig into games, I'm sure I'm missing some guys. Tight ends, we can dig into that with game by game. So let's go into Vegas versus Baltimore. Take a look at our first game here. And with Vegas and Baltimore, we're looking at a 41.5 point total with an 8.5 point spread in favor of Baltimore. And Las Vegas just looked terrible last week, and Baltimore, they lost another game to Kansas City. They used the same strategy that they used last year in the playoffs. That was probably not the best strategy to use. And it was surprising, especially now that they have Derrick Henry on the team, that they didn't run the ball more. I felt like Henry just really wasn't being. He only got 13 carries, but they fell behind pretty early. They ended up losing 27-20, but it felt like they were playing from behind for a good portion of that game. He ended up scoring a touchdown in that early part of the game, and I thought it was going to be wheels up for him, and he just really did not do anything for the rest of the game. But I do like him in the matchup this week. He's a guy that I want to keep in my player pool this week. I probably won't have a ton of exposure to him. He's 6,700, but as far as what Baltimore or Las Vegas was giving up, they gave up that big game to J.K. Dobbins coming off those injuries. So Derrick Henry should do pretty decent against this matchup. And last year Vegas was only giving up 17 DraftKings points a game to running backs. So they had a decent run defense last year, but as I said, they just really didn't do that well this year, or at least in week 1 against J.K. Dobbins. So yeah, just keep that in mind with Derrick Henry. Based on last week, he's in a pretty decent matchup. Zamir White, there was a pretty even split between him and Madison last week. He got 13 carries, and Madison got 5 attempts. but he ended up getting 6 targets as well, so he was used in the passing game a significant amount, and he scored a touchdown in the passing game. As far as the passing game, he only got Zamir White only got 2 targets, so uh, that wasn't really good for Zamir White owners in best ball. Devontae Adams only had 10 DraftKings points last week, but he's facing off against Baltimore, who has given up, let's see, only 14 DraftKings points a game last year to wideouts. So not the best matchup for Devontae Adams, but he's going to continue to get a bunch of looks. Last week, as far as targets, he had 6 targets. So not a whole lot of targets that you would expect for Devontae Adams last week. Zay Flowers, again, probably not the best matchup against Vegas. Vegas has a way of preventing wide receivers to score touchdowns. At least like they have like the last couple years. Maybe it'll be a little bit different this year. But last year they were giving up 18 DraftKings points a game to wideouts regardless. So still a decent matchup for Zay Flowers, who runs pretty evenly split between slot, left side of the field and right side of the field. He's like 30% in each of those areas. So, he gets a decent amount of slot work, but a decent amount of outside work. And 18 DraftKings points a game is what Vegas has been given up at least last year to the wideouts. So interesting matchup there for Zay Flowers, but I really my main interest in this game in general would be for Derrick Henry. As far as tight ends, see if got any tight end matchups. Nothing really stands out in the tight ends situation. So, not a whole lot in this game that I'm interested in. But Derrick Henry's a guy that we can keep in our player pool this week. Let's move on to the next game. We got Carolina versus the Chargers, and this is a game where Justin Herbert is, he's pretty interesting. We saw that the Chargers last week wanted to run the ball a lot, so Herbert didn't really get that many attempts, and it shows up in the points scored. He only had 10 DraftKings points, but that was a game that they controlled against Las Vegas, and I wouldn't expect anything different here against Carolina, who's just been awful. Carolina is a matchup where you really want to target your running backs against. Running backs, Carolina was giving up 25.4 DraftKings points a game last year to that position. And, like as far as the passing situation against Carolina, they gave up Burns. They traded Burns to the Giants. So they really gave up one of their best defenders. And I would imagine that teams are going to have a lot more success in the pass against Carolina this year. So Justin Herbert is interesting there, but I just don't think that Carolina has like any juice to overcome, like any matchup really. Like they just looked horrible again last week. We're gonna have to wait and see if Bryce Young is able to get it together. I really didn't understand the hype on him last year going into the draft. He seemed like just like this really small quarterback, and just didn't understand why he was going to be the first overall pick last year. But I was going along with the herd on, okay, maybe this guy's good, and then he just like was awful last year, and he starts off this season pretty bad as well. Looking at 11 DraftKings points in last week's game, so nothing stands out really here except for the running back situation. J.K. Dobbins down at 5,400 and Gus Edwards at 5,200. This might be a game where Gus Edwards has more opportunity because I really don't, Carolina's not going to be a threat at all to them. And Last week, he had 11 attempts for 26 yards, so he did really bad. Like, if you looked at my preseason analysis, I put out a short video on the Chargers, and it was really like the argument was, do you really expect them to focus on this running game over Justin Herbert? Because Harbaugh had never had a quarterback like Justin Herbert before to work with. And the run game that they brought in from Baltimore, just these Baltimore like dusty running backs, Dobbins coming off, like all these injuries, and then Gus Edwards, he had a ACL tear a couple years ago too, and Edwards is just, like he's always just been a guy who can get you there, but he's not going to get you like anything else. Uh, he's a solid running back, can do the job well, but he's not going to give you like a ton of explosive runs and stuff like that. But Dobbins, on the other hand, has that capability. And, coming off of this, like the Achilles tear and the ACL tear, I just was not expecting him to have like any juice. But last week he had that really good game. So Dobbins is a guy that I think we can keep in our player pools this week. I think they're going to just obviously control this game and just have their way with Carolina. The other position of interest in this game, at least against the Chargers last year, was the slot receivers. Slot receivers last year scored 19.9 DraftKings points a game against the Chargers, which would make where is he at? Thielen pretty interesting. Thielen is, he's expensive relative to the rest of the receivers in this game at 5,200. But, with the weaker pass defense, McConkey, Carolina pass defense, McConkey looks like he'd be a decent pick for salary relief at 4,900. And he actually did pretty good last week, too. He ended up getting 7 targets and scored a touchdown last week. So decent showing from Ladd McConkey last week, but how much usage is he going to get this week, given the matchup, is going to be the big question. So all right, so let's move on here. Tight end, really nothing stands out in the tight end matchup for either team in this one. So, like another game where maybe you can keep a couple of these guys in your player pool. Dobbins is interesting, and, maybe Ladd McConkey or something like that. Really, not really too interested in Thielen, but he does have a decent matchup. So let's move on to this New Orleans versus Dallas game. Now, in this game, we're looking at a 46.5 point total. Dallas is 6.5 point favorites. New Orleans looked pretty good last week, but they played against Carolina, team that we just discussed. So we can take a look. We can take a look right now at how the New Orleans slot receiver did against them. Let me check and see who is the main slot guy. Shaheed runs 48% of his routes in the slot. So yeah, there's that slot against Carolina. If you're looking at McConkey at all, maybe you can look at Rashid's performance last week as an indicator of how the slot defense is there. It was the Chargers defense that is weaker against the slot, but I think with Brian Burns out, or with Burns off the team now for Carolina, then the passing game. We saw what New Orleans was able to do against Carolina last week. So I don't think that the Chargers really want to use the passing game, but it's a really good matchup for Justin Herbert in that passing game if you wanted to kind of bet against that, like that that general consensus that they're not going to want to pass the ball. They want to run the ball. Let's see. Olave didn't do anything last week. He ended up with 3 DraftKings points. Against Dallas, I don't see him doing any better. The best matchups in this game are going to come for Dallas's slot receiver, who's CeeDee Lamb. This is where New Orleans was giving up 19.7 DraftKings points a game last year to the slot. Didn't give up, too much last week, but they were playing Carolina. So if we go by last year's data for that, CeeDee Lamb has a really good matchup. So keep CeeDee Lamb in your player pool. Last week, he got 10 targets. Didn't really do too much with it. Keep in mind, CeeDee Lamb was out for the majority of training camp, so he's coming in to last week's game with not much prep work going in. So probably take him a couple weeks to get acclimated. But yeah, CeeDee Lamb has a good matchup this week if you wanted to dabble in that. But otherwise, these defenses are pretty good. Marshawn Lattimore, let me check his injury situation. I think he's out or at least doubtful for this week. Yeah, he missed a bunch of practice. Looks like Marshawn Lattimore is going to be a game time decision versus the Cowboys. So if he's out, that gives even more steam for CeeDee Lamb. Not having a top corner in the league to potentially to shadow him or whatever. So CeeDee Lamb would be very interesting tomorrow. But he's at 8,800, and there's just too many other good cheaper matchups on the board. But he's a guy that you can keep in your player pool this week. Brandon Cooks as well. Cooks, with their lack of weapons, and they just lost Ferguson, the tight end. So 7 targets last week, 14.5 DraftKings points, scored a touchdown last week. Brandon Cooks is a guy that you can keep in your player pool at only 5,600. Shaheed, Dallas was only giving up 13.4 DraftKings points a game to the slot receivers last year. So not really looking for Shaheed to repeat what he did last week. He had that decent game last week. He scored 16 DraftKings points off of 5 targets. He ended up getting a touchdown there. So otherwise, I'm not really interested in this game. There were some things that they were doing different on the offense on New Orleans side. Clint Kubiak, I believe, is the new offensive coordinator there, and he was showing some decent signs of improving that offense. I know that Warren Sharp is very high on motion, and Kubiak was implementing a whole bunch of motion into that offense. They went from like one of the worst teams at using motion to one of the best. And that should do a lot of good for Derek Carr, who we've seen has a lot of upside in the past. But against this Dallas defense, it's just gonna be really, really tricky for them. I think New Orleans is in play in future weeks, but maybe not so much this week against Dallas. All right, let's move on to this next game. Tampa Bay versus Detroit. Now, this is a game that I'm really interested in. So make sure to hit that like button. Get us to 30 likes so I can put out a shorter video later on. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. About 200 off of 1,000 right now. So help me get to 1,000. I definitely appreciate that. Appreciate everybody who subscribed recently. I've had about a 50% increase in subscribers in week 1. And a lot of that, has to do with the success that these shows have been having. Had a lot of hits on Captain, like I mentioned, and then last week had a bunch of hits on the main slate too. So let's take a look here. I was very surprised, given that the total of this game is 51 and a half draft or 51 and a half DraftKings points, 51 and a half point total with Detroit as 7.5 point favorites. I just think that this game is the perfect shootout situation. We saw it with Baker Mayfield last season. They played in the playoffs. Baker Mayfield ended up having a really good game. He got off to a slow start last year. They played each other twice. Detroit and Tampa Bay played each other twice last year. They didn't really do too much in the first game, but the second game was the playoff game. And in that game, it was 23-31 in favor of Detroit. That was the final score. But Baker Mayfield threw for 349 yards and 3 touchdowns in that game. And Detroit's defense really hasn't, they didn't look in week 1 like they had improved very much. They brought in Carlton Davis, the corner from Tampa Bay. So there's a lot of familiarity there between Tampa Bay's weapons and Carlton Davis. I would anticipate Mike Evans to get the better of that matchup. Just based on Mike Evans, his ability to make contested catches and just general ability as a wide receiver. I think that like the weapons on the Tampa Bay side, we saw Chris Godwin have a big game. He's back in the slot now. And the weakness of, Detroit and Tampa Bay, they're both pass funnel defenses. They're both really good run defenses and really, poor pass defenses. And you see that especially in the slot where Tampa Bay has given up 22.7 DraftKings points a game last season, and Detroit was giving up 22.8 DraftKings points a game last season. And those are the 2 worst teams at defending the slot in the entire NFL. And we happen to have 2 of the best slot receivers in the league going up against each other in this matchup, in Chris Godwin and Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I think they're going to have a lot of success in the passing game in this one. On top of that, Tampa Bay has a bunch of injuries in the secondary. They got a cluster of injuries last week in the secondary. Take a look here. Bryce Hall is now on IR. Zion McCollum is in concussion protocol. Josh Hayes left last week's game with an ankle injury. And Antoine Winfield was already he's already been ruled out for this week, but I'm not sure if I think he was out last week too. So Tampa Bay's secondary is really beat up, and we know what Detroit can do with their offensive weapons. And then Tampa Bay really doesn't have any resistance on Detroit's secondary, and they got the familiarity with their. I would imagine that. Carlton is at least one of their best corners. Let me, I mean, it's just a solid matchup for both teams. And let's look at what Godwin did as a slot corner that we're interested, or slot receiver that we're interested in. Eight targets, 8 receptions, 83 yards. He scored that touchdown. If you watched the show last week, we were targeting Chris Godwin because of his matchup against Washington last week. Washington was also very bad against slot receivers. And I like Godwin's matchup again this week. Last week, I wasn't so high on Evans' matchup, though. But Evans this week, he should be in a really good spot this week. And last week, he ended up getting 2 touchdowns, which really jacked up his receiving score. That last touchdown he scored, by the way, was what knocked me out of winning a seat in that live final. So that was really really tough pill to swallow. Let's see what Evans did last year in that playoff game against. I think he had a really good game against Detroit in the playoffs. All right, let's take a look. Going to share the Pro Football Reference. Let's wait for this thing to load here. But as you can see, like I talked about earlier, Baker Mayfield had 349 yards and 3 touchdowns. Let's see. Give it a second here. All right. So if we scroll down, we look at the how the game played out last year. Baker Mayfield's top targets, Evans had 12 targets, 8 receptions, 147 yards, and a touchdown. Godwin, like I said, this was before Godwin had started playing a lot in the slot again. 8 targets, 4 receptions, 40 yards. Cade Otton's a guy that we are going to be interested in this week. He's last game against Detroit, he had 8 targets, 5 receptions, 65 yards, and a touchdown. He's right now at he's at minimum price, and he makes a good piece if we're looking for some salary relief, and he works well in the stack with Baker Mayfield or a double stack with Baker Mayfield. If you wanted to use Baker Mayfield as your quarterback this week, Mayfield, price wise, he's only at 5,900. He's one of the cheaper quarterbacks on the slate that have upside. Goff is a little expensive at 6,400, but I like the price on Baker Mayfield, and I like the matchup, and I like the ability to stack him with these weapons. And these Mike Evans is under like 6% projected ownership this week. Meanwhile, Chris Godwin, he's a little bit higher. He's at 19%, I believe. And Amon-Ra St. Brown, let me check what his projection is, because he's got that good matchup too. He's a little bit higher, I believe. No, he's only at 14%. So just the ownership on this matchup is great for us. And Jameson Williams, who broke out last week, I called him as the captain in Showdown last week. He's got a really good situation too, with those corners being banged up on Tampa Bay's side. So every weapon is in play that we would want for a shootout, and the running back situation, like the Bucs only gave up 15.7 DraftKings points a game last week to the run, and that was among the lowest in the league, if not the lowest in the league. They got that stout run defense. Yeah, it's the lowest amount of DraftKings points a game to the running back position, and Detroit was right down there with them in like bottom 5 DraftKings points allowed to the position as well. And they just picked up DJ Reader. So they're an even stronger run defense this year than they were last year when they were really good. So, the pass game is just really set up for a good game, good matchup this week. And these are guys that we're going to want to, when we get to the lineup building stage, I'm going to be plugging in a lot of this game, especially the high total. This is why I'm shocked that it's like so low owned, and I'm kind of thinking that it'll gain steam before the games start. I don't really know where other people are focused this week, because I haven't listened to a whole bunch of DFS content. I focus in on showdown slates. So I'm really not focused in on the main slate until later in the week when I get to take a look at it. And that was always better for me anyways, because when I start thinking about the main slate too early in the week, I talk myself off of plays, and it's always haunted me. But last couple years, I've focused more on, waiting until later in the week to really focus on the main slate. So that way my, like initial thoughts on it are what I can go off of. And you saw, if you watched last year, we had a ton of success with the main slate show on top of the showdown shows. But last week, came in third in the slant. I had a couple close calls with live final tickets and stuff like that. So, just really like this game, Detroit versus Tampa Bay, and we'll take a look at that when we build lineups later on. Indy versus Green Bay. Too bad that Green Bay lost Jordan Love, because there would have been a really solid matchup in this, seeing Richardson versus Love. They're playing in Green Bay, so they're playing outdoors, but Richardson showed that ability to make those huge splash plays. Only threw for 212 yards, but he had a few bombs that he threw throughout the game. Ended up getting 2 touchdowns, 2 passing touchdowns, added 56 rushing yards onto that with a touchdown, 27 DraftKings points, one of the highest scores on the slate. This week, he's 6,800. It's not terribly expensive. It's a guy where if you have the extra salary, he's definitely worth plugging in. Problem is, he's going against Malik Willis this week. And, Malik Willis, I was shocked when Green Bay signed him to be their primary backup. Maybe they see something in him. He's a guy that with a lot of raw athleticism, very similar raw athleticism wise to Anthony Richardson. He's not nearly the athlete Anthony Richardson is, but like the type of prospect. Just a guy with not a lot of experience, but a lot of athletic ability. But, Willis, every time he's gotten his chance, the dude has not performed. Last week, he got in the game and he got sacked in a critical situation with the game on the line. So that just gives you a little bit of a indication of Malik Willis. I'm from, I live in Tennessee, so I pretty familiar with Malik Willis. He got traded from the Titans to the Packers, and I just don't think he's going to do very well in this matchup. And I'm surprised they signed him as their backup. All right, let's take a look at the. Let me look at the actual numbers here. Now, where I'm interested in Green Bay is the running back situation, because Josh Jacobs with Indy, the reason why we targeted Joe Mixon last week, and I was high on Joe Mixon last week, was because Indy last year was giving up 26 DraftKings points a game to the running back position, and last week they gave up another 29 to Joe Mixon. Ended up, being one of the guys that helped me do really well last week. And he was one of our, in the short video that I put out, he was one of the 5 guys that I recommended in my short video. Now, that's another reason why you want to hit like on this, because when I hit 30 likes, then that triggers me putting out a short video closer to lock when I have my final thoughts together. And last week in that short video, I had Jaden Daniels, I had Joe Mixon, I had Chris Godwin, just a bunch of guys that hit. I think the only guy that didn't hit was Zach Ertz. I had him as a stacking partner with Jaden Daniels, but that really didn't even hurt us. If you guys used him, because he ended up getting targeted a decent amount, but he just didn't deliver with it. But it really didn't hurt too bad. But yeah, this week the situation with Josh Jacobs, he's going to get a lot of work this week, and problem is Indy's going to be expecting it, obviously, because Malik Willis is in the game. But last week, Jacobs had 16 attempts for 84 yards. If you watched the show last week, Spread a Stare for the Showdown show was high on the running game on both sides. The anticipation, like they were playing in Brazil against the Eagles, and both teams were going to want to get out of there as quickly as possible and try to get the game over with. So he anticipated a lot of running in that game. That ended up coming to fruition. Jacobs just didn't get the touchdown he needed. But I would imagine that Jacobs obviously going to get a decent amount of work in this one. And he's got a really good matchup to do that with, as I mentioned, with Indy giving up so many DraftKings points to the running back position. So Josh Jacobs is a guy we're going to want to keep in our player pools this week, and he's 6,500. So he's more on the expensive side, but he's he's not super expensive. Jonathan Taylor's the other running back in this game, and Green Bay wasn't great against running backs either. They gave up 21.7 DraftKings points a game to the position. So, it's a decent matchup for Jonathan Taylor as well. Problem with Jonathan Taylor is Anthony Richardson is going to be taking those touchdowns towards the goal line. And Taylor got a touchdown last week. He ran 16 times for only 48 yards, so that's only a 3-yard per attempt average. That was against Houston, and he ended up with 10, 11 DraftKings points. But this week I think that Indy should control this game. The only thing they have going against them is they're playing in Green Bay. LaFleur is a really good coach. I think he can coach Malik Willis maybe to be better than he was in Tennessee. So remains to be seen there. They also have a bunch of decent young weapons in the the wide receiver core there. A bunch of decent receivers on the Green Bay side. So we'll see how Malik Willis does there. But I'm thinking that this is going to be a game where both sides are going to be focused more on running the ball. One thing that is interesting, though, is Adonai Mitchell. Now, I saw a tweet by Jordan Vanek. He was on the show with us last year. He came on our Super Bowl show to help us break down the game. He's a good analyst on wide receivers. He's with a bunch of companies now. He used to be with the 33rd team. But he put out a tweet with the AS report for, I believe, Fantasy Points is the website that he put that out for. And that is has to do with separation that these guys are getting. And Adonai Mitchell last week was able to get a ton of separation in his matchups. And he ended up getting 5 targets, but a lot of those were inaccurate passes from Anthony Richardson, who, raw athletic ability, still needs to work on his accuracy. Only led to 1.2 DraftKings points. Mitchell is still only 4K this week, and he's in a matchup where Green Bay likes to use a lot of man coverage. And Adonai Mitchell's ability to get that separation, he was the top. If I'm looking at this article, I'm going to share this article with you guys. Now you can see that's Jordan Vanek. But if you look at the top separators, Adonai Mitchell is number one. His separation score was a point, 667, head of Mike Evans, head of Jameson Williams, all these guys that had big games. And his ability to get that separation is what I like. His win rate was 44%. He's in a man. He's going in a matchup against a team that likes to run a lot of man coverage this week. And if he's able to get that separation and they decide to, the coaches and the coordinators are going to recognize, his ability to get that separation last week. And they're going to probably try to work him in a little bit more this week into their game plan. And I just think that at 4K, we can't really go wrong with Adonai Mitchell, having him in our player pool this week. 5 targets last week. Josh Downs, I believe, is out. Or let's check Josh Downs' situation. That was one thing that helped. Yeah, he's questionable this week, but he'd be coming off of an injury. Downs was upgraded from limited participation Wednesday and Thursday to full participation on Friday. So it looks like Downs might be back this week, which kind of sucks for our situation with Mitchell. But I would imagine that Mitchell is still going to get a decent amount of work in this one, and that separation against man coverage. I just think that he's going to be in a good spot at 4K, and he's a cheap guy that we can use for salary relief this week, and just kind of hope that he still gets a decent amount of work. All right, so let's move on from this game. Giving you guys a bunch of the guys that I like there. Actually, let me double check here. Green Bay's tight end has a good matchup too. Indy's giving up 12.9 DraftKings points a game. Now, Kraft and Musgrave. Kraft was getting more of the routes, I believe, last week. He got 3 targets, 2 receptions, 37 yards. Versus Musgrave ended up with 2 targets. It's a split between these guys. But if you wanted to work in Kraft or Musgrave into your lineups, think Malik Willis will be probably trying to dump off the ball a lot. That's another reason why I like Jacobs, because I think Jacobs will probably get a lot of dump offs along with maybe these tight ends in this matchup. So keep that in mind. But the timeshare I don't really like between those guys. And other than that, I don't think I saw anyone else interesting. Indy slot receiver. Green Bay was giving up 20.5 DraftKings points a game last season to slot receivers. Now, sorry, Green Bay was giving up that. And we saw A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown had a big game against them, which makes me, I think probably the closest, style of receiver to A.J. Brown might be Mitchell, which makes him even more interesting. But it might also be Pittman. Pittman's at 6,600. But, for that price and, like the ability of Anthony Richardson to get him the ball, I just don't I don't know if I want to pay 6,600 for Pittman in this matchup. Let's see who was doing the main slot work there. Yeah, Josh Downs. I mean, if Josh Downs is back this week, that's going to make him interesting in this matchup. We saw Josh Downs. He had a lot of big games last year. Was out last week, obviously, with that ankle injury, but he may come out of the gates slow. He's only 4,800. If he's playing, it's going to be tough to decide. Like if he's the guy that we want to have interest in this week. Let me check real quick with the breakdown on the slot routes that Mitchell was running last week. All right, so I'm looking at PFF here. Give me a second. Pre-snap position. Mitchell was running 39% of his routes out of the slot. So, I mean, all these signs point to Mitchell having a decent game if he gets a good amount of work. The ability to create that separation, the man coverage aspect, and then on top of that, he's running most of his routes out of the slot, where Green Bay was giving up 20.5 DraftKings points a game to the position last year. So just keep Mitchell in your player pool. Long story short, because he could be one of those guys that goes off for us that has super low ownership. Cleveland versus Jacksonville. This is a game where we're looking at 41.5 point total on this one, with Jacksonville as 3-point favorites. This is another one. I really just don't have any interest in this one. Deshaun Watson, 12.66 DraftKings points last week. Watson's a guy that, he can get us 20 DraftKings points pretty easily. Last year we saw that a lot. People talk about how he sucks and he's not the same quarterback that he used to be, but last year he was getting us 20 DraftKings points a lot. And we just kept targeting him because he was cheap. And this week he's only 5,600. If you're looking at the matchup against Jacksonville, Jacksonville gave up 18.8 DraftKings points a game to quarterbacks last year, which is like a decent amount. It's like a top 10 amount. They were giving up 18.5 DraftKings points a game to wideouts, which makes me like Amari Cooper as well. If you wanted to do a Cooper to Watson stack, I don't hate that. Like given the cost of Watson, let's see what the price is on Cooper. Cooper is 6,200, so he's not super expensive either. Last week he got 9 targets, only caught 2 of them. That was against Dallas though, so they come into a much much easier matchup this week. I believe Jacksonville last week. Who'd they play last week? Yeah, they were using a lot of man coverage last week. Let me see if I can see how Cooper does against man coverage. Let me see if I get a read on this. All right, Cooper, he has a 22% target rate against man coverage. At least he did last week. So, yeah, I mean, last week Jacksonville ran 67.6% man coverage against Miami with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. So I would imagine they're going to keep that going, but with Cooper getting a 22% target rate against man coverage, expect him to get a decent amount of targets this week, and he's got a beatable matchup with the 18.5 DraftKings points a game that Jacksonville's given up to wideouts. So keep that in mind with Cooper. It's also interesting on the Cleveland running side because Jacksonville has given up 22.4 DraftKings points a game to running backs. And, Jacoby Ford would be the beneficiary there. And Ford last week, he had 12 attempts for 44 yards, but they were getting smoked by Dallas. I would imagine we see a decent amount of work from Jerome Ford this week, and he's only at 5,900. So he was one of those cheaper running backs that we looked at when we were going through that. So, some pieces here on the Cleveland side. Maybe this game is a little sneakier than people think, but that's all going to depend on Deshaun Watson. And now he's got another accusation against him. So, who knows where his head's going to be in this. But, yeah, probably a game to pass. But, there's some interesting aspects of it. Looks like there's going to be rain, too, from the looks of the DraftKings situation here. All right, let's go to the next game. Let's get rid of this one. San Francisco, Minnesota. Jordan Mason, as I mentioned, really liked him in Showdown. Unfortunate that McCaffrey got ruled out so far away from lock. Otherwise, we would have crushed. But had a huge game, 28 attempts for 147 yards and a touchdown. Didn't really get targeted in the passing game. But that's good for someone like Deebo Samuel, who Probably got a lot more of that work that Christian McCaffrey would have gotten in the passing game. That's another reason why I liked Samuel last week. 9 targets, 5 receptions, 54 yards only. Scored a touchdown, though. He ended up getting 18.7 DraftKings points, which is what we were looking for, which is really good against the Jets. And now he gets a much easier matchup. Take a look at Minnesota's matchup here. I believe last year they played against each other. Brian Flores, the coordinator of the Vikings, likes to blitz a lot, and their defense is really good. Only allowed 17 DraftKings points a game to quarterbacks, but they're susceptible to wideouts, giving up almost 20 DraftKings points a game to wideouts. And, that's going to make Debo's matchup really interesting. That's also showing up in his ownership. Let me take a look real quick at what his ownership is. We're looking at 28.6% projected ownership for Debo. So, don't really like the ownership situation. The matchup is there. Juwan Jennings, might be interesting as well, but they just don't run 3 wide receiver sets out that much. But 18.9 DraftKings points a game to the slot. The DVOA matchup definitely favors Debo over Brandon Ayuk, but Debo also runs 30% of his routes from the slot, which is where the DVOA matchup is the most favorable. So I just think that Debo's got a really good matchup in this. He's going to be my player pool. I'll probably use a decent amount of him. On the Minnesota side, like the slot. Who was running from the slot last week for Minnesota? Let me check that out real quick here, because that's where the ideal matchup is on Minnesota's side too. Vikings had Brandon Powell running 46%. Justin Jefferson ran 38% of his routes from the slot last week, which is interesting. Puts him in a decent spot because last week the 49ers were giving up 17.8 DraftKings points a game to slot receivers. And if you watched the game last week or watched the show last week, we were, or I think it was just me on that one. I was high on the slot receivers for San Francisco last week, Gibson and Lazard. And the reason I was high on them was because of how susceptible San Francisco was to the slot. And we saw Lazard come through with 2 touchdowns. Wasn't as heavy on him as I should have been. I should have had him in my shorter video too, but I just didn't know how the situation was going to break down with him and Gibson, despite having a decent matchup. But yeah, this week, that puts Justin Jefferson in a good situation. He's 8,300 though, so you got to decide if you want to pay up to put Justin Jefferson in your lineups this week. Ownership wise, I can take a look at that real quick and get an idea of what his ownership's going to be. Ownership wise, he's under 10%. So Justin Jefferson, anytime you can get him under 10%, that's a good thing. 8,300 though is the hesitation there. Last week, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 59 yards, touchdown, 15.9 DraftKings points. He's got Sam Darnold as his quarterback now. Sam Darnold coming from San Francisco, played there last year, and Darnold played really well last week. Kevin McConnell has, seems to have a tendency to draw out performances from his quarterbacks. We saw 208 yards, 2 touchdowns, 15.62 draft. So maybe not that great, but they were playing with a monster lead over New York up until, I believe, they started to pare down Darnold's usage in that big lead that they had Darnold was doing really well before he came out of that game. So Darnold, keep him in mind. Not the best matchup for him, as San Francisco's only given up 15 DraftKings points a game to quarterbacks. But thing that we're interested in there is Justin Jefferson. And Justin Jefferson has a pretty decent DVOA matchup on top of it. So, I do like Justin Jefferson this week, but he is, he's expensive. Jordan Mason, probably the main takeaway here is Jordan Mason is in another pretty good spot, with Minnesota giving up 19.7 DraftKings points a game. And then Debo also in a good spot, but ownership is going to be high on both those guys. But Mason's going to give us some nice salary relief, so I still like him. Seattle at New England. Let's look at this game real quick. Seattle at New England, 37.5 point total, with Seattle as 3.5 point favorites. Nothing really stands out for either matchup in this one, but we're looking at wide receivers. New England gave up 18.7 DraftKings points a game to wide receivers last year, and Seattle gave up 17.8 DraftKings points a game to wide receivers last year. If I'm looking at the DVOA matchup, it looks like the slot receivers are favored the most in that situation. That would be Jackson Smith and Jigba and Demario Douglas. New England runs a lot of man coverage too, and DK Metcalf that would favor. But New England, they did pretty good in their Week 1 matchup against Cincinnati, and were able to hold Jamar Chase to like a decent. They did a decent job holding him at bay. Metcalf last week, 4 targets, 3 receptions for 29 yards, no touchdowns, 5.9 DraftKings points. But that doesn't really mean too much in the scheme of things. He played against Denver last week. I think that this would probably be an easier matchup for Metcalf this week. But I think Jackson Smith and Jigba might be the guy that we would want to have interest in if we wanted to have interested in anyone. He's only 4,900. Last week, though, he didn't get a lot of usage. He only got 2 targets for 19 yards. I think the anticipation was with the new offensive coordinator in Seattle. The dude likes to push the ball downfield. They weren't able to do that against Denver last week, but they won the game. Denver has a really good defense, though. So, maybe we see a different situation with Seattle this week. So DK Metcalf, he's interesting at 5,900. Smith and Jigba is pretty interesting at 4,900. But I just don't think that they're going to get enough. It could be a very similar situation as it was in Denver, where New England's not able to put up, points against them. They're playing outdoors on top of it. And, we got nothing really stands out other than that wide receiver situation in this matchup. Demario Douglas would be the guy with the best DVOA matchup. And last week he had 3 targets, 2 receptions, 12 yards. Brissett looked pretty bad out there last week. I wouldn't be surprised if we see May come in sometime early in the season to take over that role. I was surprised when I saw Brissett announced as the starter, because I thought that May had done enough to get that starting gig. But, there's a lot of games that are easy to cross off this week. And that's probably one of them. But, I mean, you can sprinkle in those wide receivers into your player pool, but I wouldn't go too heavy on them probably. Tennessee versus the Jets. This is a get right game probably for Aaron Rodgers, and uh, that San Francisco offense did not do well against. I mean, sorry, the Jets offense did not do well last week against San Francisco. Let me find them here. We're looking at a 40.5 point total with the Jets as 3.5 point favorites. The matchup for the Jets favors the wide receivers with Tennessee giving up 16.9 DraftKings points a game last year to wideouts and 20.1 to the slot. But Tennessee has revamped their secondary. They brought in Ladarius Sneed, and they're just probably a little bit better this year in the secondary than they were last year. Let's see. Garrett Wilson would be the guy that we're interested in, though. 7.1K, 11 targets last week. Rodgers likes to hone in on those alphas. He would likely get Snead's coverage, I would imagine. I'm guessing that they do shadow coverage, but slots also have a good matchup against Tennessee, and that puts Lazard back in play. We saw that Rodgers, Rodgers is one of those quarterbacks that it takes a while to earn his trust, and Lazard obviously has earned his trust because he, made the Jets sign him. And last week we saw what Lazard can do with Rodgers back at QB. He's ended up scoring 27 DraftKings points, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 89 yards, and 2 touchdowns. It feels like chasing to go with Lazard this week, but the matchup is there. So do with that what you will. But Lazard has a decent matchup, and Wilson has a decent matchup. On Tennessee's side, we saw Mason have that monster game against the Jets defense last week. And last year, the Jets were giving up 24.9 DraftKings points a game to running backs. So that makes Pollard interesting. Pollard showed no signs of the injury that he was recovering from last year. He ended up rushing 16 attempts, 82 yards, and a touchdown, 4 targets, 3 receptions, and 12 yards last week. The only really roadblock for Pollard is Levis and his ability to keep this team in this game. Levis last week was pretty bad. Probably one of the worst quarterbacks in all of last week against Chicago. He ended up with 127 passing yards, 1 touchdown, rushed 4 times for 36 yards. He's got a lot of weapons, but we have to wait and see. Well, we don't want to obviously target Levis against the Jets. It's probably going to be more of the same from last week, but Pollard, I would anticipate getting a lot more use in this matchup this week. They'll probably try to run the ball a lot against this Jets team. Jets, meanwhile, will be in situation to pass, and then they got Breece Hall in the run game. But Tennessee was pretty good run D last year. They only gave up 18.8 DraftKings points a game to the running back position. Who did they play last week? Oh yeah, Chicago. Chicago running backs didn't really do much last week. So, so not much happened last week against them. But I do think that Breece Hall is the guy who can win in this matchup. Hall, one of the top 3 running backs drafted all throughout the offseason in best ball. scored 19.3 DraftKings points last week. Didn't really do too well against San Francisco, but he ended up scoring a touchdown and getting a bunch of targets. So we know he's used a lot in the passing game as well with Rodgers at quarterback. So I think that Breece Hall could have a decent game here. The matchup, at least the points allowed by Tennessee to the running back position, might give a little bit of not hesitation with him, but less exposure. I would say Rodgers was probably pretty embarrassed after last week's game. And, he's got these weapons. Lazard has a good matchup, which is good for Rodgers. And then Wilson has a decent matchup. And Tennessee is weaker against the pass than the run. Rodgers might be looking to, pick apart a defense like this. They got Ladarius Sneed, though. They held Chicago at bay last week, though they lost that game. But yeah, don't be surprised if Rodgers comes out and has a decent game in this one with a little softer defense than the 49ers that he faced last week. But I don't know if he's going to have enough to justify playing him over a guy like Baker Mayfield, who's at about that same cost there. So I'm going to skip this game. Move on to the Giants versus Washington. This is another interesting game. I was talking about it at the top of the show. Daniel Jones has that really good matchup against Washington, but it's Daniel Jones. He was one of the worst quarterbacks last week. He's coming off an ACL tear, and he's a guy that he's a running quarterback. So that's like his bread and butter is running the ball, and we don't like to see these quarterbacks or any person who relies on their legs coming off an ACL tear. So Daniel Jones, even though he has a good matchup, maybe it's a bit of a get right spot for him too. They lost 28-6 against Minnesota. Obviously he was rusty. Probably was not playing. They probably weren't working him as hard in the offseason, coming off that injury. But he's got weapons like Malik Neighbors. Neighbors is only 5,900. He's got the best matchup, one of the best matchups on the slate against Washington. We target Washington all the time in the passing game. Just some of these numbers Washington's given up. 18.7 DraftKings points a game to wideouts. That is the most in the league. That's what they gave up last year. They gave up 23 DraftKings points a game to slot receivers. That is also that is the second worst in the league, right behind Philadelphia. And if you remember, we targeted Jaden Reed because of that matchup against Philadelphia. But the slot receiver here that we would be looking at is Wan'Dale Robinson. So Wan'Dale Robinson, let's see what his cost is here. He's at 4,300, so he's at a really good price. I don't hate leaving Wan'Dale and Neighbors in your player pools. And if you're looking for a really cheap stack, I don't hate stacking Daniel Jones with both Neighbors and Robinson. And maybe we see if we get a like some sort of offensive output from these Giants against Washington. Let me see. I guess it doesn't really matter what they did last year because it's an entirely different team, coaching staff. From the Washington side, New England, New York is dealing with they have a new defensive coordinator as well. But the weaknesses in New York last year were running back. They were giving up 22.9 DraftKings points a game to running back position. By the way, Washington was also giving up 26.4 DraftKings points a game to the running back position, which puts Devin Singletary in play. But last year, this game might be a sloppy shootout, is I think the bottom line on it. But New York was giving up 22.9 DraftKings points a game to running backs, and they were giving up 20.5 DraftKings points a game to the slot. We'll come and check out who was running in the slot last week. That used to be Jahan Dotson, I believe. But last week, it was Luke McCaffrey was running 83% of his routes from the slot. So if you're looking for a run back, Luke McCaffrey would be interesting. Let's see how he did last week. Last week, McCaffrey only had 3 targets off 3 receptions for 18 yards, but the matchup here is interesting. It just matters. We got to see how Jaden Daniels does. We know that what's his face, the offensive coordinator, former coach of the Cardinals. They used to call it the air raid, but like in the NFL, he's been the horizontal raid, which could be good for Luke McCaffrey. So maybe if you wanted to stack this game, let's do a quick stack on this one. You could put in Jaden Daniels. He's at 6,200. That's not too expensive. I'm going to take a drink of water here. Give me a second. I don't hate the price on Jaden Daniels. If we wanted to stack him with Luke McCaffrey and then maybe run it back with Neighbors, let's say that Neighbors has that poor guy on Washington. He was a rookie last year. I can't remember his name, but the corner had to delete his X account last year because he was getting burned every week, and he got burned again last week against that Tampa Bay Mike Evans. I think burned him pretty bad. Daniels to McCaffrey, running it back with Neighbors. All rookies there. McLaurin's only 5,700 too, so if you wanted to use him, you could use him. But McCaffrey at only 3,800. Let's go into let's leave those guys in there for now, and we'll get to making this build here in a second. But not one of my favorite builds, but I just want to play around with it because of the cheapness of the stack. But Wan'Dale Robinson, I'm also interested. I don't think I'd want to double stack this game. I want to get just enough pieces to give me some salary relief in this game. So we'll get back to this in a minute. Let's go into the Rams versus Arizona. This is another interesting game. Let's look at the total here. Looking at a 49.5 point total with the Rams as 1.5 point dogs in this one. It's kind of surprising to me. This is another one of those games that has some good individual matchups. We're looking at 19.5 DraftKings points a game is what the Cardinals gave up to quarterback last year, and 19 DraftKings points a game is what the Rams were giving up to quarterback. But Rams also have a really good matchup as far as running backs because Arizona gave up the most points per game to running back positions. So let's plug Kyron into our lineup here as one of our running backs. Now, Cooper Kupp, if you remember last week, My reasoning for starting him in our showdown lineups was because of the offensive line situation for the Rams. They're in a situation where Jonah Jackson was having to play center for the first time in his career, and he's new to the team on top of it. On top of that, he was injured like throughout the offseason. And there was a bunch of moving pieces in that offensive line. And then I think they even got more injuries like during the game. And so my theory last week was that Stafford was going to be under siege throughout the entire game, and he was going to be dumping it off to Cooper Kupp all game long. And that ended up happening, and he ended up actually getting more enhanced when Puka Nacua went out, and it just made Kupp go nuclear. So I like Kupp again this week. I think it's going to be a similar situation where Stafford's just going to Kupp all night. I think Demarcus Robinson also will be in play at 4K. I like that price. But let's put Cooper Kupp in this lineup. So we got Jaden Daniels to Luke McCaffrey. You could also run Daniels naked easily in this matchup instead of putting McCaffrey in there. But let's put him in there for that salary relief. I'm putting Kyron in there as well. So we got two Rams. I think that these two guys will take up the majority of the work in this game. For a high total game, 49.5 points. Let's find who we want on the Cardinals side. Looks like a wide receiver Marvin Harrison could be interesting. Rams were giving up 18 DraftKings points a game to wideouts. They were also giving up 13.5 DraftKings points a game to tight ends, which is pretty high. So you got Marvin Harrison, but you also got, let's put Trey McBride in to this lineup as our run back for Kyron and Kupp. So we got Trey McBride there. So this stack, the correlation is coming along nicely in this lineup. Marvin Harrison really didn't do much last week, and by all accounts, it looked like he wasn't able to get much going at all in the matchup against Buffalo last week. But this week, I wouldn't be surprised to see him have a better game against this Rams defense, especially that was giving up 18 DraftKings points a game last season to wideouts. But remains to be seen what the situation is with Marvin Harrison. But for the purposes of this lineup, I'm going with Trey McBride over Marvin Harrison. Cincinnati versus Kansas City. Another interesting game. Every game that we've seen these guys play in the regular season, ends up being a pretty good game. Let's look at the history between these guys. Reason I bring that up is people are down on Joe Burrow. And people are down on Joe Burrow, but he's still a solid quarterback. He was hurt for the majority of last season. His wrist was injured, and let's get over here. But he's one of those elite quarterbacks that when he gets put in one of these types of matchups, it's going to flip a switch in him. They let their guard down in New England last week, but if he's able to flip that switch, despite all the things working against him with, like a different offensive coordinator, missing T. Higgins, all that kind of stuff, he's still got Jamar Chase. let's see. So the last regular season game they played against each other, Burrow was hurt in the 2023 game, but they won 27-24. They beat Kansas City 34-31. So there's going to be a lot of ego going on in this game. And the game in 2022, Burrow threw for 446 yards and 4 touchdowns. And then the next season, he threw for 286 yards and 2 touchdowns. So 2 really big, and he rushed in a touchdown too in that game. So 2 monster fantasy performances by Joe Burrow against Kansas City. The playoffs, a little bit different of the situation. The one where the Bengals went to the Super Bowl, he had 250 yards, 2 touchdowns. And the one where they lost to Kansas City, 270 yards and a touchdown. So, I mean, Burrow turns it on against Kansas City is the point I'm trying to make here. And I think that this is a game where there's going to be no ownership. Let me check the ownership on Burrow. Let's see. Burrow's got 1% ownership projection because of how he did last week against New England. Let's not forget the Bengals always come out of the gates slow. Let's check out Jamar Chase. Chase is projected for around 5% ownership. So we're looking at a decent ownership projection for these guys. The defense is the same. Spagnuolo hasn't been able to figure out Joe Burrow, and they lost Ladarius Sneed on top of that on Kansas City's side. We might have to do a Joe Burrow stack on this show as well. The total is 47.5 points. Kansas City's 5.5-point favorites. There's a lot working against Cincinnati, but ego is working for Cincinnati. And, even though Burrow, there's a lot of talk too about like him lifting up his water bottle. He was had a flimsy wrist lifting up his water bottle. So everybody thinks that, his wrist is still hurt. But, they usually come out of the gates pretty slow. Burrow's coming off of a year, where he was hurt. He's going to turn it on in this game. I mean, they might have lost last week's game because they were looking ahead to the Kansas City game and they thought that, New England would be an easier matchup. So it was kind of a letdown spot for him, even though it was the first game of the season. But, I'm not going to write off the Bengals against the Chiefs. I think this is going to be a marquee matchup, nationally televised. They have a history. They have a rivalry going. They're playing in Kansas City. That's the only thing I don't like for Burrow on this one. But, Mahomes finally has weapons too. They got Worthy. Hollywood's not going to be playing in this one. He's on IR. But they got Worthy. What's Higgins' situation? Let me see. I see him as doubtful, but unable to practice this week. Yeah, he's looking like he's not going to play. But they got Worthy on Kansas City's side, and they got obviously Kelsey. Kelsey's going to they're going to be treating this like a playoff game because right now in the matchup between Burrow and Patrick Mahomes, Burrow's up in that matchup. He's won 3, and Mahomes has won 1. So it's 3-1 in that head-to-head matchup. Not counting this game in week 16, I believe, of last year, because Burrow didn't play in that one. But Burrow's up 3-1 in that matchup. So you know that the team is going to be taking this game, putting a little bit more emphasis on this game. And these ownership projections coming in so low. Let me see what Kelsey's ownership is on top of it. Yeah, Kelsey, he's coming in a little bit higher. He's over 10%, but there's enough here to like in this scenario where we can maybe try to stack this game a little bit. But I'll do that. I'll do that a little bit later on. And I haven't even mentioned Pacheco yet. Pacheco probably has the best matchup out of all these guys, because we saw Ramondre Stevenson just run nuclear on the Bengals, and now Pacheco gets this matchup. Pacheco didn't really do too much last week, but Pacheco's going to be in a good situation. They're not going to have any trouble running the ball. They're not going to have trouble passing the ball. A lot of the Cincinnati just lost Reader. They traded Reader to Detroit, or Reader signed with Detroit. So there's big splits in how that run defense performed last year with and without Reader. And we saw, what that reality is with Ramondre Stevenson last week. So don't be surprised to see Pacheco have a good game. Let me see what Pacheco's ownership is, see if he's... Yeah, he's coming in around 10%. So he's not super high either. So I see a lot of good pieces of this game. A lot of usable pieces, but he's 6,900 too, so that's expensive. But we'll play around with it. Let's go on to this next game here. Pittsburgh versus Denver. I mean, this game is just this game's going to be... On paper, there's a decent matchups for both sides on this one. I see that the running backs against Denver last season were getting 26.7 DraftKings points a game. That is going to obviously put Javonte Williams and some of these running backs in play. He had 8 attempts for 23 yards. First game of the season. I'm not really paying too much attention to these box scores, but the matchup is should be pretty good. Who did Pittsburgh play last week? Let's see. Najee Harris has a decent matchup too. And Najee, I was saying during the preseason that he would probably end up getting the majority of that workload. He had 20 attempts last week. I think Jaylen Warren might be a little bit hurt too, have some sort of an injury. He only got 2 attempts, and Najee was used in the passing game as well. I think Pittsburgh is just committed to Najee because he was a first-round draft pick. They had some high expectations for him. I think they're in take lock on Najee, even though that Warren has shown some decent upside. But Denver gave up 26.7 DraftKings points a game to running backs, so that makes Najee very interesting this week. And his price is $5,500. So he's another one of these cheap guys. And I think people still have the mentality that this is going to be a split backfield. And it still could be. Maybe Warren was a little bit hurt last week. But if Najee ends up running away with this backfield, and he's got this really good matchup this week, and he's cheap, that makes him very, very interesting. On the Denver side, the running back there also has a good matchup with Pittsburgh. Gave up 21.6 DraftKings points a game. But Pittsburgh's defense is healthy this year. I think can't remember the Cam something. I can't. My brain is not functioning right now. But he was out for a good portion of last season. And I think that's what led to the running game, the run defense not being as strong as it normally is on Pittsburgh's side. So, I wouldn't read too much into how running backs performed against Pittsburgh last year. But Pittsburgh was weak against the slot as well last year. They gave up 21.6 DraftKings points a game to the slot. If I'm looking at slot receiver, let me see how many, what the breakdown was against slot receivers last week. Denver really didn't have like a go-to slot guy. Josh Reynolds ran 21% of his routes in the slot. Sutton ran 15% of his. Mims not really doesn't really show how many he ran, but that is where the weakness is for Pittsburgh's defense. But I really don't see any guys that are going to take advantage of that. How many did Sutton run there? 15% for Sutton. Unless they scheme Sutton in the slot a decent amount this week, I really don't see anything I like in this matchup other than the Najee Harris situation. Yeah, low scoring game though in general. Nothing I'm going to plug in to this right now. All right, so let's reset here and focus back on this lineup. All right, so we got first build is going to be Jaden Daniels, Luke McCaffrey, running it back with Malik Neighbors. Very cheap way to go there. We were able to afford Williams, Kupp, and McBride from the Cardinals versus Rams game. I mentioned earlier, Jordan Mason can get us some salary relief. This is let's see, puts us in a situation a little bit further away from that Rams Lions game that I like, but let's see what we can do here. Let's put Kupp in the flex because he's got that afternoon game. So that leaves us with 4,200 per guy. Let's put in our defense. Bengals, Raiders, Tampa Bay. I don't like the Bucs. I don't like the Saints. I don't like the Vikings. I don't like the Panthers. Don't like the Cardinals. Not a lot of cheap guys options there. I don't like the Packers. New York Giants could be interesting, but we're stacking that game already. Titans might be interesting. Let's go with Denver. I think that's the cheapest one I see with a better matchup. Leaves us with 5,700 for a wide receiver. And I want to go in this Tampa Bay Detroit game for my final piece. It leaves us with Jameson Williams, talked about earlier. Takes out Godwin and Evans, which I don't like. Really, the only option there is Williams on the Detroit side. Let's see what the and Laporte is too expensive to put him in the flex. So, Jameson Williams is probably who I'd end up with here to finish out to round this one out. But like this is a type of lineup that's it's not going to have a ton of. Some of these guys have decent ownership. Cup's got decent ownership. McBride's got ownership. Daniel's got ownership. I think Williams has ownership, and Mason maybe it does have a lot of ownership. McCaffrey is not going to be owned though, and Williams is not going to have heavy ownership either. So those are your little spots to get different there. If I look at the, let's see. Yeah, I don't really have a look at the optimal right now to see which way the field would be going. I messed around too much with my my player pool and my optimizer, so I can't give that to you guys what the general optimal lineup would be. Let's see. So let's clear this out. This is a direction that you can go. There's a lot of options there. If you wanted to put Cup in the wide receiver spot instead, and then have that flex spot open at 5,700. At least this with options like Singletary, who I said had the good matchup, but we don't. That's too many pieces of that game to stack. McLaurin, same issue. Yeah, I just don't see a ton that I like. Dobbins. And scrolling down, like Deontay Johnson is cheap. He's at 5,100. But, that Bryce Young situation is just too sketchy. McConkey, if you go lower here. Brian Thomas had a decent game, but he's got Cleveland matchup. So you do have options. I mean, you guys get the picture. Let's get rid of this lineup, and let's go into that Detroit game. I want to put Baker in. I want to stack him with at least Godwin, maybe both guys. Let's try a double stack here. See what we can do. Let's get Mason in there for that salary relief. Already said we'd like the Broncos. Let's put Adonai Mitchell in this one. And our other running back, I want to get Cooper Kupp in there. So our other running back, let's put Kyron in there, see where that leaves us for tight end. 4,200. I mean, that's pretty good. This is a double stack. Oh, we haven't run it back with anyone yet on the Laporte is too expensive for that. I would have to get rid of like Kupp or Mitchell. Let's try to get Jameson in here. Oops. Jameson Williams here. Leaves us with 2,900 for tight end. I don't even know if we can buy a tight end. Yeah, they still got $2,900 tight ends. Dolchik, 3 targets last week. I mean, that's not horrible. And other than that, I really don't see any decent options there. So let's if I put Luke McCaffrey in there instead of I already took out Adonai. Let's put Adonai back in there. Let's put in Otten. And let's take out Let's take out Evans and see. Yeah, that gets us to St. Brown. So if we went in this direction, we could go. We got a double stack with Baker, with Godwin and Otten, and then we have running it back with Amon-Ra. That way we got Godwin and Amon-Ra, the guys with the two better matchups, I believe. Was that the case? I think we said that. I think I said that they had. Yeah, they the two best slot receiver matchups on the slate. So that's an interesting way to go there, where you can get that exposure to that game, that stack, and then we also have that exposure to the Rams, Arizona. Although we're not running it back with anybody in that game. But I don't really, I'm not really too upset about that. But this is an interesting way to go, I think. Let's see. Let's build another one with that Bengals thing in mind. So there's one direction that we can go. We got Adonai Mitchell, who I talked about, the separation aspect. We got Baker Mayfield. This game I really like, Tampa Bay versus Detroit. We'd be able to run it back with Amon-Ra. I'm not going to fill out that last spot. We got Kupp in there and Williams, who I think is going to be basically the offense for the Rams. And just a lot of good matchups in here, and decent ownership projections. So let's clear this out, and let's go into Burrow's stack. Burrow at 6,300. We're going to pair him with Chase. And we're going to run it back. Maybe we run it back with Worthy in this one. No, let's run it back with Pacheco. And then maybe we go to Worthy later on. Let's get Mason in there. That's easy salary relief. Let's get Kupp. And then as far as tight ends, let's see. See if I can find a decent price on a tight end. My kid is going nuts downstairs. He just woke up. Let's get our defense in there. I'm going to go with those Broncos again. It's going to leave us with 4,400 per guy. If I wanted to get Kyron in there, let's see where that puts us. 3,300 per guy. Probably getting too expensive with our guys here, and it's not letting me put in. Let's get Pacheco out of there. Let's put in Worthy. And I don't know if that puts us in a much better situation. Get Charbonnet for that salary relief. Yeah, no. It's going to be hard to stack that game and have guys that I like in the lineup still. Let's take out Kupp. Let's put in Godwin. Now, let's take out Williams, put in Kupp. 2,400. Yeah, no, that doesn't leave us with anything. That's going to be a tougher way to go. Let's look at running backs and see if we can find someone cheaper than. If we put in Dobbins, that leaves us with 2,800 at tight end. And that puts us in no one interesting range. Yeah. I just think that's it's just a tougher way to go here. And I really wouldn't want to stack Burrow with anyone else. Like this lineup kind of makes it's going to force us to take out a guy. Like let's take out Cup, which I don't want to do, and let's put in Williams. We'll worry about the flex situation later. As far as tight ends, find a cheap tight end here. Fant has a good matchup. I didn't bring it up in the breakdown, but Fant is a guy that I had my eye on. I think there was some the type of defense that New England runs, I think is favorable for Fant. So let's put him in at 3,600, and that's going to give us a little bit more wiggle room here with our running back situation. That way we can get Pacheco in. There we go. We got at that case we got Pacheco and Worthy as options. We get like a Burrow to Chase, Worthy and Pacheco. But I really want to get like at least Kyron Williams that could get in there. So you'd have an option of you could put in do one version with Pacheco and then one version with Kyron Williams. At least that way we get that Rams exposure. Or you could go back down to Charbonnet instead of Williams. Does that get us to Cup? No, that doesn't get us to Cup. So, it's a little bit trickier to build it that way. But there are some I think a lot more options when you build with the Baker Mayfield uh, situation. I think if you played around with this lineup a little bit more, could probably make it work so you can get those guys like Cup and guys like that are going to be like the free squares this week into your lineups. But make sure to hit that like button. Get me to 30 likes. I'm going to play around with it a little bit more. 30 likes will trigger the next video, and that'll be a short video, a little bit closer to lock. And subscribe to the channel because you're going to want to get the alerts for when that video gets posted, and help me get to 1,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel. Getting really close there, but definitely appreciate it. And I will see you guys with the short video later on. Thank you.